Good afternoon, everyone. I am absolutely delighted to welcome each one of you to this incredible climate educational program. My name is Juan Pablo Beltran, and I will be your facilitator for today's session on the position of business and non-state actors. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of this gathering. Climate change is one of the most pressing challenges of our time, and it demands collective action from all of us, governments, business, organizations, and individuals. The impact of climate change is already being felt globally, and the urgency to act has never been greater. Today, our focus will be to understand the role of corporate actors in the COP space and how we can leverage their potential to create bigger impact in addressing climate change. We'll go through what we can expect from these entities in the fight against climate change and how they can become essentially partners in this shared journey. Furthermore, we will discuss the issues of green and youth washing by corporate actors. These topics are crucial as we aim for transparency and sincerity in climate action efforts, ensuring that we hold organizations accountable for their commitments. Last but not least, we will examine the concept of net zero claims and what it means to be net zero aligned. Around this program, we will encourage open dialogue, exchange of ideas, and foster collaboration in a learning environment. Your active participation and diverse perspectives are invaluable as we work towards innovating solutions for a sustainable future. Remember that the success of this program lies not only in the knowledge you gain, but also in the connections you make and the actions you take beyond this room. Together, we can make a difference. So let's make the most of this opportunity to learn, engage, and inspire one another. I invite you, each one of you, to share your thoughts, questions, and experience freely. Let's change ourselves, challenge each other, and collectively strive for a better, greener, and more sustainable world. Thank you once again for being part of this crucial program. Your presence here today is a testament to your commitment on creating a positive change. Now, let's start our journey towards a more resilient and climate-conscious future. If you have any questions or you need any assistance through the session, feel free to reach out me or Gaia or any of our helpful staff members. Let's get started.
Thank you so much, Juan Pablo. Hi, everybody. My name is Gaia. I'm going to be your second facilitator for this session. As you can see, I am Italian. I'm actually calling from Italy today. I'm really excited for the session that we have ahead today. So without further ado, let's dig in. Just before we start, a reminder to share your learning process with us on social media. You can see the contents on the slide right now. And a quick reminder of our rules of engagement. They're always the same: respect, respectful language, and inclusivity, all the same sort of values that we try to live by. Once again, we ask you to respect them for this session, both on Zoom and for the people that are following us on YouTube. A huge welcome also to the people that are tuning in for the first time because of this special session that we're hosting today. I hope that you enjoy this training and you're more motivated to also catch up on the previous and future sessions when they will become available. So for the participants of the training, I am just going to remind that the attendance form for the session will not be shared in the chat this time, but will be sent via email only to the participants after the session. So we do invite you to relax and enjoy the session, try to learn as much as possible. We're planning a quite packed set of great speakers. So do enjoy that, and then we'll think about the attendance form later. The agenda for today will have the first expert speaker that I'm going to introduce in a few instants, a very special guest, Paul Pullman. We planned an interactive session for this first part, so really looking forward for it. The second speaker will be Camilla, talking about the Net Zero Tracker, and that will be followed by a Q&A. As always, we're going to have our 5 minutes break. And after that, we're going to have a very special guest that is going to talk about a very cool project. I don't want to spoil too much about this because I think you're going to be as excited as me once you see it. And then our wonderful Charmin is going to end the session with her intervention, followed, of course, by a Q&A where you're going to have the chance to interact with her as well. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our first speaker. It's our absolute pleasure to have Paul Pullman today with us. Thank you and welcome, Paul.
Good to see you, Gaia.
Paul is a business leader, campaigner, and co-author of Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take, which became a Financial Times Business Book of the Year. He works to accelerate action by business to tackle climate change and inequality. As the previous CEO of Unilever from the period 2009-2019, Paul demonstrated that business can profit through purpose, delivering shareholder returns of 290%, while the company consistently ranked first in the world for sustainability. Today, Paul works across a range of organizations to deliver the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which he helped develop. So once again, welcome, Paul. And together we decided not to deliver a formal presentation, but rather to be open to engage with our audience today through a more interactive sort of session. I do have a few questions for Paul myself, but after my little interview, we will open the floor to people from the audience. For this purpose, I just want to share a reminder to please use the Mentimeter as usual. You can go on the website www.menti.com, use the codes that you can see here. I'm going to leave it there for a few instants so you can take notes. And you're welcome to start firing questions away straight away. And even as we conduct the interview, and then you can also vote the questions that you want me to read out to Paul so that I will do that after the interview. Right, so maybe we can stop sharing the screen and allow Paul to take full screen. I'm going to just start by asking you, Paul, if you can tell us a bit more about your past experience, your current work, and in general, what you're trying to achieve as a way to allow our audience to get to know you better.
No, thanks, Gaia, for this opportunity, and Juan Pablo as well, and for putting this course together. And it's great to see my dear friend Charmy and also participating. I have a lot of respect for what she is doing. And this global youth climate training is probably more important than ever. In fact, you call it youth climate training, but you are probably half of the world population now. And certainly at the polls and in politics, you have a far bigger influence and ability to put us on the right course versus perhaps what you yourself take credit for. I'm also the chair of the Side Business School at Oxford, so I'm very happy to see, in this case, the Smiths and other people at Oxford having played such an important role in putting this together, having 178 countries there, and you gaining that knowledge is very much what we need right now in this very fast changing field, if you want to. You know, I'm actually, I decided after 10 years of Unilever that I could have a bigger influence moving from what some people might call formal or board authority into more of a moral authority. It was very clear to me that business has always been there to solve the world's problems, not to create them. And yet collectively, we're not very good at that. So I put my thoughts in a book called Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take, which is sort of counterintuitive to the way many businesses operate. It's become a bestseller. It's in 14 languages. And it has resulted in us doing a lot of talks and thinking about how to change education and working with industry collectives. And all my energy actually goes towards driving the broader systems change that we need. We're moving in the right direction. There's no question about it. We're in first or second gear. But it's also clear to all of us that the issues are still created at a faster pace than we're actually applying the solutions. So my goal really is not only to reduce that gap, but actually move into what I call the net positive territory. If I will argue later on, even the net zero is probably becoming confusing and clearly not enough when you see by opening the newspapers or by watching television that we literally entered the formal aids of the Anthropocene, where human beings are deciding what climate and future of this planet Earth will be. And frankly, we're putting it on fire, as you can see right now. So what I do is bring industries together. I have a convening power in the private sector. So we look at it by sector: fashion, food, tourist and travel, etc., and look around the value chain. Bringing the CEOs together makes them collectively more courageous. Looking at it across the value chain allows us to accelerate things which otherwise might get stuck. And that's the most important thing. But for that, we also need leadership. So we spend a lot of time on coaching the CEOs and driving the CEO courage, as I would call it, to higher levels. Working on education and changing the course of education is another area we get involved in to change leadership. And then last but not least, we need the money to flow. So I spend a lot of time on the private sector and the multilateral institutions and others to ensure that we get money directed to the places where we can get the biggest results or where it's needed most. So private sector, leadership, and money is basically it. And in my spare time, we run a few foundations. As Charmian knows, my wife and I are very proud of the Kilimanjaro Blind Trust, which has 25,000 visually impaired children in schools in East Africa. We're expanding fast there, and that keeps me grounded, if I may honestly say, and reminds us all what this is all about, to give dignity and respect and equity to all people in this world. And then my wife runs a wonderful foundation, which is called Reboot the Future. What is needed to bring these values back? She started with the golden rule that you find in every religion, but what values do we need to get people to behave the way that we actually need or expect them to? So that's basically it, amongst some other things. And recently bought a farm, so I've become a farmer, because moving to regenerative agriculture and changing our food system is probably one of the key things that will get us to combating climate change. And I want to just learn a little bit more about that. So there you have it in a nutshell. After running Unilever for 10 years, which was a tremendous honor, and using Unilever, its size and its scale as one of the biggest companies in the world, to really show that business can be a force for good and driving the more transformative changes that undoubtedly we're going to talk about.
Thank you so much. I just noticed your pin, actually. Very cool. Just a side question. What products are there in your farm right now? What are you looking into?
Oh, in our farm, we're moving to regenerative agriculture. We are doing rewilding. And then 1/3 of it is really feedstock for animals and all that stuff. So the main areas are rewilding and regenerative agriculture. And it's not easy, but for example, we had 30 people from across the food system in the UK at our farm a few weeks ago to really see how we can accelerate UK policy. So I'm using the farm more to, again, create that multiplier effect. Food, as you well know, is very local in a sense, and although we have global directions, we really need plans on a national level. It's one of the reasons we created the Food and Land Use Alliance, but now we need to step it up and put it in practice. And in the UK, where I live, the gap between what the government says and what is really implemented on the ground is simply too big. And the wonderful thing with food is it puts people in the center. It gets to the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. And frankly, it has the highest return for investment. Every dollar invested has an $18 to $20 return, and the effects are pretty quick. So the world has signed agreements at the COP15 to restore 30% of our, protect 30% of our land, oceans, and forests. We have in Europe just passed the Nature Restoration Bill. People are getting increasingly aware also in the COP process that it's not just an energy transition, but as much importance of restoring our biodiversity and changing our food systems. And that's very exciting, but we have to put that into action now, really.
Thank you so much. My next question is specifically about COP, and I was interested in knowing your view about it, and especially how it's changed over the years, what you could spot in these changes. And then what do you think about the upcoming COP, and what sort of things can we expect to happen there?
That's a lot in one question, but let me try to be brief and see if I can answer it. I've been involved in COPs for the last 15 years. I was in Rio plus 20, where we decided in 2012 to develop the Sustainable Development Goals. I've been a champion for the Race to Zero now. I'm a COP advisor to the government, so I've been involved in many of them, and I've seen them change over time. It stands obviously for the Conference of the Parties. It's really a UN-led process that was agreed already in 1995. In fact, in 92 already, the UN recognized, believe it or not, that climate change was a serious issue. And it has done some things about it. Sometimes we're a little cynical about the UN system, but we got the Kyoto Protocol, we got the Paris Agreement. But broadly, I have to say that after 30 years of COP, trying to focus on bringing climate change under control, we have to conclude that until now, we failed miserably to slow the global rise in temperature. You know, this decade again, we're projecting a 14% increase in emissions, and we need a 45% decline. We're well off track. We're applying solutions, but they're more linear, and people, just like COVID, are probably discovering that the problems are exponential. I like 1962. That was a defining moment for me. Although I was only 6 years old then, Rachel Carlson wrote her book, The Silent Spring, and pointed out the devastating effects on the environment of the way we were doing things. In her case, mainly the chemical companies, but the destruction of the natural environment. That was a milestone, I believe. And then Earth Day in 1970, I was pretty active then, 20 million people on the streets, including from elementary school, secondary school, making clear that we needed to take action. Then James Hansen, probably one of the most influential persons, a NASA scientist, told Congress already in the US in 1988 that we have a 99% chance that global warming is real. I mean, how close that you can get. But then despite of that, then the 28 COPs, which has taken us about 30 years, I think we're coming to the conclusion that just depending on these negotiations alone is probably betting on the wrong horse. What is very important is that we really show with actions in the real economy now that things are moving, that it makes enormous sense. And by doing so, hopefully de-risk a very gridlocked political process, may I say. We created the Marrakesh Partnership at the time of the COP in Morocco for global climate action. That was the first time that we brought industry together. In Peru, we created the parallel track, which was a very important COP, the COP20, because it really prepared for the COP21 agreements in Paris. Don't often get enough credit for it, but Peru, Manuel Pulgar Filar, who was the leader at that time, they did just an amazing job. And then we have the high-level champions agenda that has been created under the stewardship of Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Nunez, with some really great people that have rallied business, finance, cities, subnational governments, if you want to, civil society all together in making enormous commitments to show that actually it can be done. Not only that it can be done, but frankly, it's the growth opportunity, the economic opportunity of the century. And I believe that these activities are currently, regretfully, running ahead of where the governments are, which are a little bit in a navel-gazing exercise. So this COP is important, nevertheless, because it's the first global stocktake. What does that mean? At the time of Paris, we agreed that every 5 years, we would look at where are we versus the results. We're obviously terribly off. But it's also important because this is a midpoint on the Sustainable Development Goals. 15 years between 2015 and 2030 to irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. We're off track, but it's good to know where we are so that we can accelerate. The messages for the COP are the same actually as what I wrote in the COP29. I always put a letter out that gets broad coverage before the COP, because I think it's important to manage expectations. People think that the COP will solve all the things, and then there are false expectations being created, and it always results in disappointment. But what we do need to be sure of is that the COP continues to confirm the 1.5 degrees Celsius as the limit that we want. We might overshoot it a little bit because we're close to 1.2. Some people think 1.5 might be reached already in the next 4 or 5 years, but we need to go back. We also need to ensure that we don't have any backsliding, that no country lowers its ambitions. We've seen some of that happening in the case of Brazil or Saudis or Australia's before there were government changes. And it's very important that we set the bar higher each time, not lower. The second thing that this COP needs to achieve once more is build trust. We've seen with the terrible war in the Ukraine or with COVID that there is a increasing mistrust at the global level between the different parts of the world, between the different countries, and that gets in the way of attacking these global issues. Will we be able to get to the 100 billion climate fund for the emerging markets? Will we be able to put funds behind adaptation or resilience building that many of these markets need? Will we be able to share some of these great innovations and technologies broadly and provide financing for these emerging markets where most of the new emissions will be coming from, so that they can also invest in this greener, more equitable, more sustainable future? And then last but not least, this has to be again a COP where we mobilize at scale more of the private sector, more of the finance community. Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber is the COP president this time. As you know, it's in the UAE, has raised a lot of flags for people. It undoubtedly has a high presence of the fossil industry, but he recently wrote a letter, and I think we have to give him the benefit of the doubt. We don't have anyway the luxury of waiting, and we need to all be there at force to ensure that the COP is ambitious enough and moves us forward on those 3 objectives. He definitely talks about fast tracking the energy transition and slashing emissions well before 2030. That's a must. He doesn't talk about how much, nor is the UAE themselves really on track. He talks about transforming climate finance by delivering not only on the old promises, but putting new frameworks in place for these emerging markets. He talks about putting nature, people and livelihoods at the center. I couldn't agree more. And finally, he wants to ensure that this is the most inclusive COP, including for young, where we mobilize as many people as possible. So the words are right. The intentions might be good. We have to give people the benefit of the doubt, but our track record there has been relatively poor. So I'll be there. I know many of you will be there, and we certainly need to work in all of our possibilities to ensure that we have a relatively decent outcome. In the worst case scenario, I've thought about that as well, and I'll stop there, that the outcome again is insufficient and that it doesn't deal with the real challenges, that there's no commitment to get out of coal or methane or very many of these other terrible forms of energy that we've invented. Then I think it's a realization, this COP could be a breakthrough, that it might be a realization that more people than just the young on this world start to realize that our political system is broken to an extent that they need to take charge. And the voices of discontent will hopefully not only go up, but the determination to force our politicians into more responsible behavior will hopefully be accelerated. So it's either a COP that keeps us on track, or it's a COP that unites the world and becomes a voice of conscience and reason to hold our politicians to a much higher level of account, much higher level.
Thank you so much. And actually, I just wanted to follow up by going at the very core of the session today and asking what role can corporate actors, and they already are playing, I guess, inside the COP space, and for what reasons do you believe it is important for corporate actors to be present at COPs? What can they bring to the table? In what way can they shape things? Also, maybe in a critical stance, trying to evaluate their role at the moment.
Well, I always say with the Sustainable Development Goals, business needs the Sustainable Development Goals, but the Sustainable Development Goals also need business. Goal 13 is climate change, but it's the same thing. If the world burns up, you don't have many businesses. Business cannot succeed in a society that fails. So on the one hand, there's a direct interest of business to do something about this because it's affecting more and more their business models. And every business now can see that as we talk. The second thing is that business is part of the issue. There's no question about it that a lot of emissions are being created by business. There are good actors in business and there are rotten apples in business that we need to get rid of. But broadly, I think there's a bigger and growing coalition of businesses that will want to take that responsibility. Business has the financing, which the countries have run out of. It has the technology. It has the resources. And frankly, as we've seen with the conversion to solar or wind or electric vehicles or heat pumps versus gas boilers and some of the other areas where we are closer to tipping points, they would not happen if business wouldn't get behind that at scale and speed. So business, unfortunately, cannot do it alone, nor should we give them too much credit yet at this point in time, but for sure they cannot do it alone. And in order to get these changes implemented at the speed and scale that we need, there is no question that we need to have the right frameworks, policies, signals from our politicians in the direction we go. And that until now has been schizophrenic at best. So business needs to be there to ensure that these politicians have the right ambitions, to ensure that we get the right frameworks in place. And it's a good thing that business has been organized. We created the We Mean Business Coalition, which puts major organizations like the B Team or the World Business Council or the UN Global Compact and many other business organizations together in a united voice. But we've also created initiatives where business is aligned. You take, for example, the Science-Based Target Initiative. It's approaching 5,000 people that have companies that have signed up to science-based targets, about $38 trillion in value. That's a big chunk. 6,000 smaller businesses have made the same commitments in what we call the SME Climate Hub. So business is showing at scale that it makes sense. And then I talked about the Race to Zero, where we have 11,000 members coming together. So thanks to the foresight of Peru to create that parallel track, to have people like us there, people like yourselves, with the negotiators, we can not only call for a higher level of ambition, we can also hold them accountable to a higher standard of morality as they negotiate. So that interaction is very important. Any business that decides not to voice their concerns or actively participate, I would argue, at this crucial time for humanity, is actually becoming complicit to the crime of climate change, which frankly is the biggest intergenerational crime that has ever been committed. So this is the moment. And by all means, once more, it's possible to solve it. And increasingly, we find that the cost of acting and doing something about it is becoming significantly smaller than the cost that we would incur by not acting at all.
Thank you so much. I think that's a very, very insightful point of view. And I think some of the questions that I can already see flowing into our Mentimeter sort of reflect the curiosity of our young people towards this topic specifically. Jumping to and targeting young people specifically and our audience here today, my next question would be, how can they best get involved at COPs with the private sector? So even zooming in more specifically about some of the things that you were touching upon before. And I'm so sorry, just a reminder for myself and for all the speakers to try and speak as slow as possible, because the audience will know that we're live translating into 3 languages. So this will really help the interpreters also if we pause sometimes and allow everybody to take it in.
I'm already talking slower than I normally do because we are in a hurry. But I'll talk a little slower even. But your question is really, if I understand it, the role of the youth in the COP process. And
with the private sector, especially.
So the role of the youth goes well beyond just the COP, but it is also fair to say that thanks to the pressure of many, not least the youth, there is a higher awareness that the voices need to be not only included, but also need to be heard. In fact, on December 8th, there is a use, education, and skill day for the entire day. This is the first time that there is a day given to a group of people versus a topic, and that's important. There is a children and youth pavilion that has been created, and that's being run by the youth itself. And then they have created the Climate Champions Youth Fellow Program. They've always been youth climate champions, and I've met many over the years, and they're impressive people. But now there is a bigger critical mass. They've also made sure that you're in what is called the blue zone of the COP, which is front and center of where the activities are. And so I'm very excited to be there. And like we did in Sharm el-Sheikh, I certainly will give a lot of weight and voice to the efforts of the youth that are there. So what can you do, and how can you be most effective also as with the private sector? I think the first thing is be an activist. We really need to be activists. Be out there, make your voices heard, join the marches around the world. The second one is leverage your economic force. There's an incredible amount of wealth that is being transferred to your generation in the next 10 years. You already are one of the bigger spending forces actually in many parts of the world. So, you know, the Gen Zs or the millennials, you can boycott companies, but you can also boycott, which is deliberately buy from the ones that are doing the right thing. We did a survey in one of my foundations amongst 4,000 young people especially, and we found that increasingly they only want to join companies which values are aligned with theirs. But more importantly, they want to be sure that there's no gap between what companies say and what companies do. And unfortunately, in too many companies, the gap is still too wide. So they're saying we either not join these companies, or 50% of them are contemplating to quit companies because they're not behaving right. And this conscious quitting is becoming an incredible force. Many private sectors people will talk about the need for talent. If you make clear that them wanting to attract talent comes with an obligation to be a responsible global citizen as a company, otherwise they will not be able to attract the talent, or their people will quit. That's an enormous force. You also are enormous innovators and value creators. Most of the innovations, the new startups, the companies that I'm involved in are run by young people. And many of these ideas might be scalable by others, but it's really those innovations that I think give me confidence that we can get there. And then last but not least, I would not hesitate to point out that you are now a tremendous positive force. We missed that in the previous elections in the US and paid a dear price. The youth was absent from the polls. I believe that during Brexit, too many were not participating, which is a tragedy of history, as it will turn out. And it's so important. Elections in Brazil or elections in Australia, we've seen that have created new momentum around the climate agenda was because of the youth actively participating. So you have this role to work with these companies, to be constructive in driving them forward. We frankly don't have another choice, but also on the political side, holding these politicians to a higher account, not least with your direct votes. So I cannot think of a more important constituent than frankly, all of you listening in today.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think it's now time for us to give space to the audience. I can already see so many questions, and I would actually just read them out if that's okay, rather than sharing the screen. I've just also reshared the code to go on to Menti and ask more questions for Paul. I don't think we're gonna have the time to address them all, but it would be nice to see what people think about this anyways. So currently, the question that's got the most votes is, how can we spot and contrast greenwashing practices from businesses?
Yeah. So greenwashing is an issue, but now also the opposite, because we're attacking a lot of people's green hushing is becoming a problem, which is where companies don't want to publicly make commitments anymore. You know, I always use the example of running marathons. I used to run marathons, I stopped now. But when I started running marathons, I had to tell people I was going to run it. And people were saying to me, you're never going to run it because you've never run one. And I was saying to my buddy, I'm going to run it with you. And my buddy was saying, I don't know, because you've never run with me. And I was saying I'm going to do it below 4 hours because I'm running it for a good cause that otherwise people will die. And people said, well, you're just bragging because below 4 hours, nobody runs its first marathon. And it's only after 9 months of training when you then finally start to run the marathon. And when you run it, in my case, in 3 hours 45, then people say, oh, okay, he might have been true. So in Unilever, I noticed the same. I made a lot of commitments on what we needed to do because it helped people in the company understand. It helped the people we wanted to work with understand. And these commitments have to be genuine. These commitments have to be in line with science. Too many companies still either don't make commitments or lowball it, what I call playing not to lose versus playing to win. So give companies a little bit of a break and don't attack the companies that make these genuine commitments in the first place. Go after companies that don't make commitments. Then you ask companies for clear milestones. It doesn't serve anything to have a commitment for 2050 because most of us will not be there. So what are they doing in 2030? Are they publishing it? Are they willing to tell you where the problems are for which they need help with others? So flush it out. Now, if there are companies that play the game, that are not serious, that just think it's, it will blow over. First of all, these companies put themselves at danger. Secondly, I would believe these CEOs are grossly irresponsible in holding a high office of that responsibility and acting like that. And thirdly, as you can see from my tweets and my LinkedIn post and everything I write, I have already decided a long time ago to call them out. I've been often in situations with CEOs where all of a sudden you stand next to them in the toilet and they say, I don't give anything about diversity and inclusion. And then they go out and someone gives them a piece of paper and they say their company has the biggest plans to include more diversity. Then I'll tell them, why do you say this to me privately? Or why don't you act and put it in place? Why do you delegate it to 5 people down in the organization and never review it? There are some CEOs that frankly don't care too much about climate change. I know they're there, but I always tell them, if you really don't care because you don't make commitments, you don't mind me talking about you, do you? Because you have the same courage. If you have the courage to say what you want to do, you also need to have that same courage to say what you don't want to do and let people choose if they want to work for you, if they want to buy your products. So on the one hand, give a little bit of a carrot and help the companies that are moving. And on the other hand, be tougher on the ones that are playing games with the future of humanity. Now, there are some other things that we can do that are very important. We need to move very much faster on governments to put frameworks in place. In the last 2 weeks, just the last 2 weeks to make it come home, I lobbied very hard for the European Nature Restoration Law. We got over 100 companies to call for that. We wrote to many of the governments and the members of parliament to vote for it. It barely got passed, but it would have been a catastrophe if it didn't get passed. But it was the voice of people like us and others that made it possible. So fight for legislation. This week alone, you might have read in the UK newspapers, we wrote a letter to Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, because the words and deeds don't match. In the last weeks alone, they have said they will slow down some of the climate action if people need to pay more. Not realizing actually that if we don't move, people pay infinitely more. How many, listen to those people who've lost well, you can't anymore, but lost their lives because of what's going on right now in Europe, or the floodings or the droughts in the rest of the world. Soon we'll have 1 billion climate refugees. Are the politicians afraid of a few that have the self-interest that say, we don't want to move because the current status is good for us? Or do they have the courage to explain to the electorate that, yes, we cannot continue to load more debt on future generations. And yes, we need to invest some money now, but the payouts will be tremendous. And if we don't do it, the cost will be significantly higher. At Unilever, we moved pretty rapidly to decarbonizing our business model, sustainable sourcing, and many other things. And frankly, we did that over a 10-year time period with a 300% return on investment. I don't think anymore for 90% of the issues that we have in the world that business really has a trade-off. The only trade-off is in people's minds. So it's an issue of leadership, it's an issue of willpower. And I think by all means, use this carrot and stick to move us forward at an accelerated speed. Sorry to be so direct in my Dutch style, but we are at that point right now in the history.
Thank you so much, Paul, for your very passionate speech. I unfortunately believe there is no more time for us to ask some of the, there are more than 40 questions at the moment, and each one has got a few votes, and it will be very interesting to continue, but maybe for another time. So for now, I'm just gonna thank you for your time and your availability to interact with us today. And I wish you a good time, and hopefully some of us will see you again at COP.
You definitely will. One thing, and if I can be of any help, don't hesitate to ask for sure. We're there to make also your presence successful. One of the things I can promise, Gaia, is that if you have these questions, just send them to me. First of all, I'd be interested to look at them. And secondly, I can provide some brief answers to these questions, and then you can put them on the site for anybody who's interested in getting some perspective on that.
That would be wonderful, because there are so many topics that, especially on the few last topics that we touch upon, that I think people would be really interested in learning more about. So thank you so much for your ability once again.
Thanks for all your time, and see you soon.
Thank you. So we're now ready to carry on. Before that, I'm so sorry, I forgot to share this QR code, which will allow you to subscribe to Paul's Net Positive newsletter on LinkedIn. There is also, a few months ago, there was also a post speaking precisely about youth and engagement. So do have a look if you're interested. Before passing the word over to Juan Pablo, I just wanted to remind everybody, all the participants of the course, that the attendance form will not be shared at any time during this session. Rather, it will be shared via email to participants only. So do not worry about it for now. Just sit back and relax. A lot of the questions that I can see on Menti are really much insisting on how can we sort of like solve this paradox between these green ambitions and some of the, what we think are the very sort of basis of capitalism. So how can we hold businesses accountable is some of the things that we talked together with Paul. And I believe that our next speaker is gonna be insightful and inspiring in showing some of the great work that's been done to back ambition up with real evidence and to demonstrate that people are really moving forward. So over to Juan Pablo to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Gaia. Allow me to introduce our next expert speaker for today. It's our pleasure to have Camilla Heislop with us. Thank you for your time and compromise. Camilla Heislop is the data lead for the Net Zero Tracker, where she coordinates a heroic team of volunteers to keep the tracker's database neat and tidy and up to date. She's also pursuing a Doctor of Philosophy on how carbon offsets fit into the Net Zero project. To these roles, Camilla brings a wide-ranging background in law, an evolving knowledge of ecology, and a particular interest in how carbon offset projects and net zero more generally affect people and ecosystems of the global south. Camilla holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Law from the University of Cape Town, and a Master of Laws from the University of Berkeley, and a Master of Science in Environment Change and Management at Oxford. Thank you very much, Camilla.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm just going to share my screen, which is always a challenge because then I realize that I have forgotten how to use my computer. But there it is. I'm hoping you can see it. Yes, I am Camilla. I'm the co-data lead at the Net Zero Tracker. I am very pleased to be here to be talking a bit about the tracker. The tracker is a project that does what it says on the tin. We track net zero and other climate commitments. And we're a project that is made up of 4 partners across the world. I am at Oxford Net Zero and kind of part of the Smith School, which is a great place to be. And I do handle a lot of the volunteer work, which is great because the volunteers at the Net Zero Tracker are the best people in the whole world. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the tracker. I'm going to tell you a bit about how we think about how net zero targets, how to tell if they're robust or not. And then I'm going to tell you a bit about our latest report, which came out in June. I'm realizing I'm probably speaking quite fast. I'm going to slow down for the interpreters. Excellent. Okay, so on we go. So you know this already, but I just want to talk a little bit about the background to why the Net Zero Tracker exists. So I'm speaking to you today from Johannesburg. I'm usually in Oxford, but I'm back home for a bit. And these are the warming stripes of Johannesburg from 1881 to 2022. And it's clear that climate change is happening now, and it's happening all over the world, but in particular in the global south, which means that we need to be doing something, and we need to be doing it quickly. And so you know this, but just to confirm that the way that a lot of people right now are thinking about climate mitigation is through net zero, which is taking the same amount of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere as we are emitting into the atmosphere. And there's been, since this kind of burst onto the scene in Paris in 2015, there's really been an incredible spread of net zero targets across the global economy. And so we are attempting to track some of those. So we look at all the countries in the world, regions of the 25 biggest emitters, the biggest cities in the world, and the biggest publicly listed companies in the world. And we're trying to understand who has net zero targets and who doesn't. And if they do have a net zero target, how robust is that target? Because I think it kind of goes a bit to what Paul has been talking about. We need to be calling out those entities that don't have targets, but we also need to be thinking about the targets that are in place. You know, how good are they? Are they actually going to get us to net zero by 2050? And so just a bit about what the tracker is trying to do before I dig in a bit to how we think about what a net zero target looks like that is credible. At the tracker, we're trying to think a bit about credibility, as I said, you know, interrogating how those targets are looking. We also try to create pressure, both kind of peer pressure and fear pressure. This kind of goes quite well with what Paul's been talking about. But I think a great example of this is H&M, the big Swedish fashion brand, emailed me about 2 months ago to say they weren't happy with how we'd represented their offsetting on the site. And so the volunteers had a look, and I said, thanks very much. Unfortunately, we can't find anything about offsetting on your website. And they, to their credit, apologized and uploaded their plans for offsetting onto the website. So what we're trying to do is create a kind of culture in which we can have a dialogue with companies so that they are as transparent as possible about what they're intending to do, and kind of create a dialogue in that way, which I think is really cool. And that also recognizes that, you know, sometimes it is hard to understand what net zero entails. It's really difficult to decarbonize your country, your city, your company. And so we're also quite interested in making sure that there's clarity about what's a good way to do it. In our, I'm just thinking I'm probably speaking so fast. I'm going to slow right down. Look how relaxed I am. It's wonderful. We just did our report. Oh, that was still fast. We just did our report. And Alexis McGivern, who you all know quite well, from Oxford Net Zero, helped us with this to try point out that there is quite a lot of convergence across the standards that we have for net zero. So there are ways that we can think about how we can set good net zero targets. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that in a second, but that's something we really care about at the tracker. Then lastly, it's kind of this context collaboration space is that we're really keen on being part of a broader ecosystem of people working on this. So that either means that we work with other people in the space who are doing really cool things like the Grantham Climate Laws of the World, who are doing really amazing stuff with Climate Policy Radar. I really recommend you check them out. But more importantly, if you can see from my slide on the Net Zero Tracker, there's a download data button. Our data is freely available for anyone to use. Please use it. Go out there and hold people accountable because you've used our data. We're a public good. Loads of people use our data, and I would really love it if you did as well. Oh, and this is very cool. We have a data explorer in which you can kind of toggle and see how your country is doing across a range of different data points that we track. So, if you want to see how South African companies are doing in terms of carbon offsetting, I'd love to see that. You can do that. So please use that as well. Go crazy. Hold people to account. Let me talk now about what I promised I would talk about, which is how to tell if a net zero target is good or not. Firstly, the best thing that can happen is someone actually sets a target. So that's the first bucket that we look at, is the targets bit. And then, as Paul mentioned, we're also interested in whether they are interim targets. So usually a 2030 or maybe 2025 target. And we're also interested in where that target is. So you might ask, has this just been the CEO mentioning that there's going to be net zero by 2050, or is it actually in the annual report of the company? That's really important, because if it's kind of within the annual report, as Paul's kind of mentioning, it like filters down into the business and people are really responding to that and feel like it's something that's part of company culture or city culture or whatever. Then the second bucket that we look at is coverage. So sometimes, not always, but often, net zero targets don't cover all the greenhouse gas emissions that entity, country or city or company might be emitting. So they might say this is a carbon only, so that might be a case where they set a carbon neutral target. And we are just looking at whether they're excluding some. And sometimes companies exclude their other scope. So they might say, we're only going to get to net zero for our electricity use, or for some parts of the company's kind of footprint. So it might be that just their head office or only certain countries. We're really interested in seeing that. So that's a really good way to unpack whether or not the net zero target is serious. And then the third bucket, in which you can ask yourself questions about how a net zero target is robust, is whether or not there's a plan to get to net zero by 2050. It's all very well to say that we're going to get there, but then we need to have some sort of plan as to how we intend to get there. And I guess going back to what Paul said, it's kind of shows that there's a genuine commitment to getting there. We are also very interested in equity. This is particularly important for a kind of governance perspective, kind of thinking about governments. We're really keen on the big economies of the world doing their fair share. So if you think about where I live, usually it's the UK, they acknowledge that they do have a greater burden to do so, but haven't brought their net zero target forward in law. I mean, it's quite a lot going on in the UK politics right now, but that would be kind of something we would consider to be part of great net zero target, is having a consideration of equity. And then a really important part of the puzzle is whether there's accountability. So is the Prime Minister or CEO or mayor going to be accountable for getting to some part of the target, whether or not that's, making some progress year by year, or whether there's some sort of hook to catch them on. And that's a really easy way for you to kind of check. And usually that's in some of the documents that people have. You might see that, for instance, the board members of a company, their remuneration or their salary or their bonuses are dependent on the kind of sustainable goals. So that's a good way to see whether or not it's robust. And then the last bit is what I'm primarily interested in, because my research is on carbon offsets. It's the net bit of net zero. So it's the taking the carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And we're interested in whether or not there's a kind of huge reliance on offsets to get to net zero. So sometimes you'll see, I see this often, a yogurt that's carbon neutral, that'll say on its little tin. That usually means that the yogurt maker has offset all of their emissions and haven't necessarily decreased their emissions down. So we are interested in whether or not that's something they intend to do. And then we're also interested in the kind of carbon dioxide removal piece, which is as many of you may know, very important in order to get us to net zero by 2050. Then very quickly, I'm just going to tell you about our report that we did in June, which we released at Bonn, and was very exciting because Greta tweeted about it, which is probably the most exciting event of my whole life. The headline thing is that there's been a huge increase over the last 3 years in net zero commitments, particularly at a company level. Today on the net zero tracker, it's 945 companies out of the 2,000 that we track that have a net zero commitment. I think in 2 weeks, when I finally work through our backlog, we will get to over 1,000. So there'll be just over half of the biggest companies in the world, which is in a way very exciting and in a way not that exciting, depending on the day and how you're feeling. What is really exciting, and one of the headline things from our report, is that from 2020, you can see that most countries had a net zero target that was proposed or in discussion. Now in June 2023, that's in a policy document or in law. So there really has been a movement at a country level. There's less of a movement in states and regions and cities. Sorry, I'm just whipping through these because, you know, I want to get to offsets, which is my true love. This is my last bit of information before I stop lecturing you. This is looking at companies on our back end, those companies with targets, who has ruled out offsets completely, who is going to use them with no conditions at all, and then who has put some conditions that, like some guardrails, to make sure that it's not bad for people or the environment. And you'll see that very few have ruled it out completely, and most haven't specified at all what they intend to do. So this is some way that you can kind of tell that there still needs a lot of movement to get us to robust net zero targets, because this is something we really should be specifying. And that is all I have to say. If you would like to be involved as a volunteer, please do get in touch, because volunteers are the best things in the whole world. And you can email me at updates@zerotracker. Please use our data, and I'm very pleased to be with you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Shar. We will continue with the question and answers. We have one here that is there any way to integrate net zero targets with climate tipping points? If yes, what will be a good way to connect? For example, USA's impact on a Gulf Stream tipping point.
A great question. So one of the partners that we have, the Net Zero Tracker, is New Climate, and they do some really great stuff thinking about how country targets this is at the Climate Action Tracker, kind of fit into a 1.5 trajectory. The tipping points bit is kind of part of that, but a little trickier because we obviously have quite a lot of uncertainty as to where we might hit tipping points. While we know that we are in danger of hitting them, it's a bit unclear as to where we might. So it's a really interesting question and a great idea, but I'm not sure, subject to correction, of anyone who's done it yet.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I was looking at the Menti, sorry to intervene. I believe I will have just easier access to the questions right now. So the other one that there's loads of questions for you, Camilla. Mm-hmm. I'm just picking the one with few votes. So somebody is asking, how can we hold accountable more influential businesses such as the oil industry?
That's also a great question. So that's an interesting thing about the oil and gas industry that we've noticed, that a lot of the oil and gas industry have net zero targets in a way that other sectors don't. And I'm not sure why that is. If it's because they're kind of public facing and feel like they need to put a positive spin on it. But we do really need to be holding them accountable. And I think a really great example of that is the Royal Dutch Shell case in the Netherlands, in which they were taken to court. But there are lots of ways. Laws are just one kind of tool in the toolkit. We target them on social media. So we're going to be doing a social media campaign in which we target entities that don't have targets. So it's something like that you could do. You could, tweet at them we could, I mean, it's always difficult, I think, to really, I mean, there's an engagement piece there of engaging with companies. Whether or not you believe oil and gas companies, I'll leave up to you. But I think it's something that we really need to be thinking about. And I haven't given you a very comprehensive answer, but I'm going to stop before I ramble too much.
Thank you so much, Camila, for your insights. And I think Juan Pablo is going to announce something now.
Yes, we're going to have a 5 minutes break. So after that, we're going to continue with our last speakers. So you are free to go take a coffee, a glass of water, whatever you want. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm just going to wait a few seconds for everybody to come back from the break. We are super excited for our next guest speaker. It's our honor to welcome Victoria Reiser, the CEO of Sankari Studios, a mobile gaming studio that harnesses the power of mobile gamers for environmental and social good. Their first platform, Catway Oceans, is now globally launched, and they just featured as Best New Games by Apple. Before letting Victoria speak about this awesome project, I'll just play a little reel. Hopefully the audio will play as well. That was wonderful. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Ciao, Victoria. Nice to see you. And oh, well, I can't see you right now because I can now. Great. Nice. That video was awesome. I'm just gonna leave the floor to you to tell a little bit more about this project. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. We're so honored to be speaking with you. So I just wanted to touch base on some of the key points, and the previous speakers mentioned education, system change, power in numbers. And, this is exactly why we're doing what we're doing. We believe that, we can reach the numbers actually now increase the 3.7 billion mobile players that are out there. and really create this movement that is about how do we change our systems. It all starts with education. You know, people have to know what they're up against, what they can do, and then what is the path to engagement and action. So this is why we've created Katoa. We're globally launched now, and we started with oceans because it really connects all of us, and it is such a big part of our climate issue and our saving us from, you know, climate change. We have a lot to do, and what Katoa really is about is, you know, teaching people what they can do and featuring solutions, and then really connecting the dots as well between players and what they can do in their backyard. Yes, I'll leave it at that for now, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. I think we're gonna gather the questions if there are any, and then if you're open to it, we're just gonna send a few over. In the meantime, I think it will be helpful for people to just look the game up and download it and start playing, essentially. The game is called Katoa. We'll send the link in a second in the chat, and we'll make sure that it gets to YouTube as well. Right. Are there any specific instructions on how to download the game? I just saw a question getting here. Yeah.
It's just go on Google Play or Apple, the App Store. You can download it there. And, you know, the other thing that I loved hearing from our previous speakers, it really is about strength in numbers. And this is why we also do what we do. But we truly believe it is all about the youth. It is all about changing, you know, our habits, changing how we consume. And we look forward to you downloading, because our whole goal is not only featuring solution, but also really showing where we can go, what we can do. And it's possible.
Thank you so much. I think it's really crucial to have that hopeful message coming across. And yeah, it also shows that climate action doesn't have to be looking only one way. It can be found in all different forms, and you can also have fun with it. So we will share the link in a second. In the meantime, I'm going to say goodbye, and thank you again, Victoria, for sharing the project and for creating it in the first place.
Thank you so much. And yes, any questions, and contact us. We're here.
Excellent. I think people will be interested in understanding how the game is already making an impact, but maybe we can like get some structured like report or like answer, and then make sure that people receive it so they can see it already. Thank you so much, Victoria. And now I'm just going to pass the word to Juan Pablo again, my colleague, to introduce our next and final speaker.
Thank you, Gaia. Okay, so we're gonna introduce our last speaker for today. It is our pleasure to have Chairman Love with us today. Thank you very much for your time and your compromise. Char recently joined Natura and Co. That is the world's biggest B Corp, as the global director of advocacy, where she's focused on supporting the business, taking a stand on key issues, and deepening relationships with partners who share a commitment to engaging in a system level change. She also continues to teach and learn with students at Site Business School, University of Oxford, where she designed the popular MBA course, The Regenerative and Circular Economy, How to Do Business in a Climate Emergency, and the executive course, the Oxford Climate Emergency Program. Char is a serial entrepreneur, having been the co-founder of Bolland's, Helitropy, and B-Lab UK, where she held the role of chair and activist in residence. Thank you very much. I leave you with our next speaker, Chairman Love.
Wow. I just need to start by saying how extraordinary the last hour and a half has been. I am sitting here and I actually am in now a sea of Post-it notes, because I've taken so many notes of so many of the wonderful contributions from both the speakers, but also the amazing questions that are coming through. So I just wanted to start with a massive amount of gratitude to the organizers for creating this space. And for all of you for being a part of this. I'm really excited to be with you, and excited to share a few thoughts on some questions that relate to how businesses can engage when it comes to the COP process. I thought I would start by sharing actually just a little bit of a story, because actually, as we saw with Paul on the line earlier, it was actually when I was in my role as chair of B-Lab UK. And I was invited to be on a panel at Unilever when Paul was the CEO. And I remember the question that we were asked whilst on that panel. And that question was, in the field of sustainability, when and how should entrepreneurs also be activists? And the reason why I wanted to share that question is because there is immense power in really well-articulated, well-thought-through questions. And actually, that's an insight I'll sort of hopefully gracefully weave into some of my thoughts later on. But just the power of a question can be really quite life-changing, as it was for me in that moment, because it made me really reflect on what does it mean to be an activist? What does it mean to be an entrepreneur? And what does it mean to be in sustainability? So, Juan Pablo, as you mentioned in the overview of the different roles I've had, I have been an entrepreneur and I have been an activist in residence. And I've spent a lot of time with sort of social movements. And now I find myself in a big company as the director of advocacy. So what I'd like to start is by just making that connection to some of the things that Paul was sharing. And again, the power of questions, but also I think sometimes this word activist is a little scary for some people. And actually, I think there's something here about how do we recognize that there's many different ways to be an activist and there's lots of different definitions. But actually, there's some really interesting things we can all do, sort of depending on what language you choose to sort of embrace when it comes to these things. But let me move from talking about that experience to what I'm doing now in advocacy. So I've been in this role only for just over a year now. And in the last year, been spending a lot of time trying to understand what does it mean to be in a big company, as someone who has the experiences that I have, but also what do we mean when we talk about advocacy? So having spent a year working with a range of colleagues from across the business, and I should also mention around the world, because we are headquartered in Brazil. I'm calling for you from London, where we also have our offices. So we do have a global team. So a range of sort of truly global conversations and shaping what does advocacy mean? Pablo, you mentioned it a bit in my bio, because really it does come down to three things. And this is where I'm going to try and do the magic of trying to share my slides. Just one second, because I realize it'll be easier to follow if I have the words on the screen. And let me go to the first slide. There we go. That was, I should say, that's just the celebration shot that we had of many of the B Corps that were in the B Corp movement at COP25. But where we are at when we talk about advocacy, really, there's sort of three parts to what advocacy means that we've kind of uncovered in the last year of building our strategy. It's really about understanding where and how we're going to take a stand as a business on the things that really matter to us. It's about mobilizing and inspiring people to use their power as a force for good. And importantly, it's about joining forces with others to drive systems level change. And again, we talk a lot about systems change, but we're also taking a page from the B Corp movement and really trying to understand, well, what is systems change? And where we're focusing is on systems change as it relates to policy change and culture change. And I'll just draw a little bit of a connection, because I think when we think and talk about culture change, that really is where education comes in. That's how we sort of think about the norms and how we learn and what we understand in how our society works. So those are sort of the three components of what advocacy is. And the other interesting insight, very much inspired by our friends at Oxford Net Zero, is a way to think about it as, yes, of course, we have to be a net zero business, right? And I can talk a little bit more about what we're doing as an organization on that front. And that's what we're doing inside of our business. And it is net zero. It's also biodiversity. It's also about human rights. It's also about our products and circularity, regeneration. These are all really critical things we do within our own business. And we have to appreciate that despite the work we're doing in our business, we are still needing to do more and do more at that systems level. I think all speakers have sort of referenced that at one time or another. And that's why, yes, we will be a net zero business, but we also need to be a business for a net zero world. And that is where advocacy comes in. Again, it's about changing the rules of the game and engaging in places where we can be focusing on policy and culture changes that are needed. So that's kind of what advocacy is. Now, in doing our work, we developed 5 principles that underpin our advocacy strategy and our engagement. And you can see these here on the side as well. But the 5 principles, the 5 A's of advocacy, as we call them. Number 1, to be authentic. And that means really being clear of where we've come from and where we are right now and being transparent. So authenticity is number 1. Number 2 is when we're building our advocacy initiatives, we have to hold very much the need for ambition. And again, I think we've all sort of felt how important it is to be moved by the things we know are needed. Now, there's kind of a bonus A here under ambition, which is also being accountable to that ambition. And the science, both the social and the physical sciences, is our guides and making sure what we are doing is ambitious enough. The third A is agency. And that's a really interesting word because agency really is about how do we inspire a desire in everyone to take action and to feel that they can engage in these issues. So for example, we have a small advocacy team at Natura & Co, but we have tens of thousands of people that are working across our businesses, and we have representatives. So how can we help them feel that there are things they can take a stand on as well and feel that they have the power to do that? The fourth principle in our 5 A's is activism. So again, there's a little bit of a theme here. And activism is important. And once I spoke to a really interesting leader of a movement, and we were having a conversation of what is activism? Like, what does it really mean? And she gave a great description. She said, being an activist is about seeing your edge, like seeing the line of like where you feel comfortable and being willing to walk up to it and then going over it. And the reason why I love that definition of activism is because it reflects the fact that activism is a relative term. Your line might be different than my line, which might be different to somebody else's line. But the purpose of it is to stretch and to move and to find those places where you can go a little bit further. Now, in our advocacy strategy, that also means that we engage and we have conversations and we find ourselves in discussion with activists. And sometimes that can be uncomfortable, but that's okay. We have to hold those places for discomfort and sort of sometimes work with people that we wouldn't otherwise work with and listen deeply. The last A in our 5 A's is allyship. And that really speaks to the point that we know we have to work in alliance. We have to work in partnership. We need to be collaborating with others. These challenges are all interconnected, and therefore it's not going to be one business that is able to solve it. We have to find ways to work together. The word and concepts of allyship also take their root from the social justice movements. And we also hold very closely to our hearts the importance of recognizing that we are in positions of privilege and we must find ways of being effective allies. And when we have platforms to speak on or to engage with, we have to think about ways in which we become allies and help those who wouldn't otherwise have access to those platforms to be able to be in those places. So it is a very key part of our advocacy strategy, which is, again, to recognize where there have been historically excluded voices and find ways to use our platforms, our privilege, and our power to open spaces for those voices to be heard. So that's where we're at with advocacy, what our definition is, what our principles are, and how we think about it really as changing the rules of the game. Now, when it comes to what the role of corporations can be at places like COP, I thought I'd sort of put together a little bit of a list based on sort of some of the experiences that I know we've had and my colleagues have had. And I will just sort of say I'm pulling on two different sort of experiences. One is with my role currently at Natura & Co, but also I can pull on my experience having been a part of the B Corp movement when we had a large groups of businesses coming to COP25 and COP26. So number one, what I think businesses can really do is ask for ambition. And Paul touched on this a little bit. We know that policymakers do listen to businesses, and we need to use this voice to really make sure that the policymakers know that this is something that we are backing. We want to be supporting climate action. So we have to use our voice. We have to use our connection to really say that we want to see change when it comes to these policies. So that's number one. Number two is to demonstrate what's possible. So within our business, we can share the stories of the things that are working as we go on our journey when it comes to products or processes that we're running. So again, really being able to show and tell some stories of what's working, but also as part of that is to show the things that we're being challenged by. Where are there issues? Where are there things that we need help solving? And that really also speaks to an important part, which is around how we find ways to learn together. And having worked in a few different sectors, I think I'm becoming more and more clear how critical it is that we understand the different perspectives that come from different sectors: private sector, public sector, academia, civil society, creatives, all sorts of different voices. We have to find ways of communicating and learning with one another. And that's one of the things that we can do when we're in places where these communities gather, in places like COP. The third thing we have on our list are to back campaigns and to join collectives. And in a few slides, I'll show just a few examples of the sorts of campaigns that we're focused on, but also the importance of, again, building critical mass, joining with others. We have a voice, but actually voice has become so much stronger when we work with others. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with my microphone. So I think that that's really important. And some of the campaigns that we also are really looking at are ways in which we can hold the COP process itself accountable. So for example, how do we make sure that we are pushing for gender equality when it comes to negotiations? How do we make sure the voices of young people? As Paul said, there is a view that a focus on inclusion for this COP. So again, we want to be a part of really backing that and lending our support to that. We also have the point about sharing and cascading the things that are happening in the COPs through our networks. So we have our supply chain, we have our customers. So really making sure that there is, and again, the shape of culture, the way of understanding what's happening at COP and sharing it out more widely so we can get more people to be engaging and to be aware of what's going on. And then lastly, there is this idea of how we might bring substance and energy to the meetings. And I do think that there's an important distinction. There's what's happening inside the COP, and then there's also the things that are happening outside the COP. And I've been involved in different events and interventions in both. And I think both have a powerful role. So again, being inside and working and having these conversations, demanding for ambition, showing what's possible and having those discussions, showing up with our friends and our coalitions, and also doing that in places outside of the formal COP process. So here's just a few. I thought a few photo montages would be quite fun here. But you can see the picture on the left is at COP26, and it was a panel that was really focused on changing the company law. And so we were there saying, as a B Corp, we believe that we need to look at company law. In this case, it was the Better Business Act and a view around Section 172 of our company law. We also were at the COP15. I know we're focusing quite a bit on net zero and climate, but obviously there are other COPs. And so the COP15 meetings, which were on biodiversity, the global biodiversity framework, which was agreed in Montreal in December. We attended those events, we spoke at those events, we had a ton of meetings. And again, we were there to make sure that we were communicating how important it was for us to have an ambitious new global biodiversity framework. And the picture below is actually a picture that came from COP26, but it was sort of one of the events that happened outside the formal COP process. But I wanted to share it because it's a photograph of what we call Boardroom 2030. And it was when the Body Shop invited a group of young people from both within the business as well as outside the business. And there's a few Oxford Net Zero people actually who were invited to be a part of it, to be in a public conversation. So it was at an event where they used the boardroom setting and imagined what the boardroom would look like in 2030. So again, invited young people, also and used it as a chance to talk about what would be some of the big questions or critical concerns for a business in 2030, and what would the young people have to say about it. So it was a very, very dynamic conversation, and again, brought a sense of what could be possible and where are the concerns to a table where people could appreciate these voices and appreciate the insights really quite deeply. And I'm happy to share more on Boardroom 2030 for anyone who's interested, because I think it's a really interesting tool to use for businesses to engage a wider group of people and to imagine what that future is going to look like in order to figure out what do we do about it today to have the best possible positive outcome as possible. I was also asked just to share a few things about some of the campaigns we've backed. But before I do, I think I also would just want to reflect a little bit on when businesses and corporations are at COP. I think there is a real importance and a responsibility to make sure not adding to the noise in a negative way. So being very clear on where our rules are. Again, with those points about ambition and demonstration and bringing substance and energy to discussions. So I think that's really important. We also make sure, we have to make sure it's not a place for greenwashing. And I think the attention on that is really, really important. But I also think it's important for us to recognize that businesses engaging in COP, it has to be in support of the agenda of the meeting itself. This isn't a chance to be focusing on advancing your own business interests. So I just want to put those out very, very clearly as being things that we just have to be constantly aware of when we look at how businesses are engaging. And what people can expect of businesses when they're at COP, I think, is just to be really clear in walking the talk. One of the campaigns that we're involved with, because it's a campaign that's run by the Body Shop, is Be Seen, Be Heard. So you can see it on this slide. So what we're doing there is really advocating for and pushing for countries around the world to find ways to support young people to engage more in political life, in political participation. In some places, that's about lowering the voting age. In other places, it's about lowering the age in which you can run for office. In other places, it's about creating youth collectives and youth groups. So that's something that we've been advocating for as part of the Body Shop's campaign. But also, again, to walk the talk, to be authentic, the Body Shop has also created its own youth collective, which is a group of young people within the business who have a role to be really quite active advisors to the strategy of the business, to, again, make sure it's not just we're advocating for that for public life, but we're finding ways to, again, walk that talk within our own organization by amplifying and really listening to the voices of young people. Now, I don't think I've got time to go through these other campaigns, but I would sort of say that there's a few of them here that are just worth keeping an eye on, because they're the things that we're looking at. We're looking at the gender issues in places like the COP meetings. So that's, you can see the picture there of She Changes Climate. We're really interested in the climate nature nexus. So an example of a campaign is 0 Hour, which is really looking at what we can do in the UK to make sure this is sort of brought into our laws. And I think I mentioned the Better Business Act already, which is about really looking at company law. So these are sort of some of the things that we feel strongly about and are taking a stand on. I'm going to close out because I think I was asked to also just share a few thoughts. Having been to a few processes, I'm feeling quite young at heart, even though I'm not young anymore. The things that have really struck me and what I've seen be successful for young people who are there is to really have that way of channeling your courage to speak out. And to speak your truth and not be afraid of saying the things that you feel based on your experience and based on your own insight. And I have been in rooms where young people have taken the stand and the conversation has really been grounded because of those insights. So make sure you know that you have an attentive audience and use your voice and be clear that that voice is rooted in your experience and therefore is valuable. And ask questions, coming full circle to the powerful question that I got once asked. The power of asking a question that can change how people think about issues is an incredible skill. So think about what you're saying, but also what are the sort of invitations to inquiry that you might want to explore as part of how you're engaging. Secondly is to listen and to absorb. So I think, again, the power of what we can listen to and understand different people's perspectives on things can really help inform our own opinions as well. And lastly, really to mobilize and to connect with one another. Hopefully one of the threads that's come through this conversation is really about this idea of collaboration and working together as a collective, as a movement is actually where we can drive a huge amount of change. So I would really encourage you to think about those people that you find that you can join forces with. But also really importantly, we've got to breathe. We got to find some joy to fuel the work we do. And we've got to find ways to dance. And I'm going to leave you with this picture of some sunflowers and along with it a word I learned a few years ago. And it's a word that I carry very closely to my heart. And that word is heliotropy. Now, heliotropy is actually a word that's used in botany. And it's a word that refers to the tendency of plants to grow in the direction of the sun. And I always think of sunflowers. And if any of you have ever seen a video, it's fascinating because as the sun crosses the sky, you can actually see the blooms of the sunflowers following it. And the reason why I love that word is because I think we as humans are not that different than our cousins in the flora community. I truly believe we will grow taller and stronger and faster when we are motivated by things that are full of light and warmth and positivity. But that's not to say that we are like a balloon that sort of is helium and floats up into the air, detached, right? That's not what sunflowers do. The other thing sunflowers are they're rooted to the ground in which they grow from, right? They are like rooted down to the ground. And a word that I kind of hear a lot in the COP meetings is radical, right? We need radical action, radical collaboration. The origin of the word radical actually comes from the Latin radix, which means rooted. So I hope everyone has a chance to think about the sun that they can travel towards, the hope, the vision for the future. And I think we all need to stay rooted to the urgency of what those challenges are that we are facing, staying rooted to our communities, staying rooted to our truths and the things that we know to be true. And we hold that sort of tension together. So being hopeful and radical at the same time. I have one last thing. I realize I'm out of time, but I do want to just sort of throw one more thing because someone very thoughtful once said to me that we must be grounded by the science and we must be moved by the poetry. And in my little notebook I carry around with me, I've got it here with me. I always carry some poems because sometimes it's poetry that really gives me the lift and the inspiration that I need. And maybe what I'll do rather than reciting it out loud when I know I want to hear some of your questions, what I'll do is I'll pop in the chat one of the poems I'm carrying with me right now, which is giving me that fuel and that hope. So thank you. And I'm excited to hear what sort of questions people have.
Thank you very much. It was an amazing talk. And some of the questions people are asking is what are the reasons why business may not consider a more substantial involvement in climate action? Is it a matter of lack of education?
Is it a lack of education? That's interesting. I think it can be difficult sometimes for businesses to engage in these spaces. And again, this is where being authentic is really important. But I think every business can engage in this space. So I think to answer that question, I'd say I think it's important for people to really be aware of the level of challenge that we're facing. And I do think that the more and more people are becoming aware and educated on how significant these issues are. So I think what we are going to see are companies stepping up, continuing to step up. And those that don't, I suspect we're going to see not necessarily having a role inside, because people will be choosing not to work there, which we heard from Paul, but also not to buy the products and services. So I think it is a matter of being aware of what the issue is, but I think there will also be other signals that will be driving organizations to be taking on this change, and it will be critical. I'll use it also as a chance to just say what some of the enabling factors that I think can help companies that are on this journey. One of them is just, I know it's not a very sexy word, but it's a really important word, which is governance. And I know this was something that was talked a little bit about in the sort of net zero tracker presentation, but governance is really key. And if we're going to really translate what does governance mean, it is how decisions are made. And I think decisions can be small decisions that you make in your business. They can be medium-sized, or they could be massive strategic decisions. But having some clear frameworks on how to make those decisions, I think, can be really valuable. And I think I've seen something come up in the chat about B Corp. So just to say, that's one of the things that's part of being a B Corp, where you actually change your bylaws or your legal constitution as a business to make it absolutely explicit that the duties of the directors, of the purpose of the business must be to advance the benefits, to equally consider both your shareholders and your stakeholders, and to advance the benefits for both. And so I think that sort of being hardwired into the governance is a really important enabling factor, as is having the culture to make sure that the rules are followed in the right way.
Thank you. Another question is, how can a young person attend a COP? What organizations should we get involved with?
Oh, what a great question. Seeing as I am I am not as young anymore. I am not as plugged into all the different organizations you can find, but I do think that the community at Oxford Net Zero and the community that's organizing these sessions will probably have good links. But I think maybe I'll say something that I feel called to bring in is I hope everyone who wants to be at COP can be at COP. But I also think if you're not there, there are also other ways to engage. And I really do want to give a shout out to the wonderful people that run Force of Nature, including Clover Hogan. And if you go to their website, you'll see what they have are a thing called climate cafes, which means it's a place to engage in these issues wherever you are. So I think if you want to be in the COP process as a delegate, I think Oxford Net Zero and the people that are running this global youth climate training will probably have the best immediate and most meaningful links, whether it's Youth for Nature, Youth for Climate, some of the organizations that are mobilizing people. But I also would want people to feel like even if you're not there, there are a lot of other ways to engage and just to keep an eye on the work that's happening at Force of Nature.
Okay, and the last question is, do you see the current political systems on climate governance, such as COPs, really engage the youth in decision-making, or are youth merely tokens and decorations when they have no voice?
Well, I think I can speak to my own experience, which is I have been in meetings in the COP processes where young people have taken a stand in sessions, and it has really impacted the way people in the room feel and think. And I can think of one particular example at COP 15, where it was a session where a young person made an intervention that everyone just felt it. It literally changed the feeling in the air. I don't know how else to describe it. It was such a powerful reflection. So for me, I have been in places where young people in these COP processes have had an impact. Do I think there are enough young people? No, I think there's a lot of room for improvement, a lot more ways where we need to find more young people having positions where they can be speaking and reflecting their values, their interests, their lived experience. So I think lots more to do, but I would say some of the experience I've seen, I've certainly felt the power of young people in these places.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for another question. Gaia, do you think we can do another one?
I think we can do another one, actually. There's also, I think, as we didn't really have any time to address any of the questions for Victoria, we could do one for Char, one for Victoria, and then like wrap it all up.
Okay, perfect. So someone is asking how to guarantee that voices emitted by young people at COP are really heard and real change are seen.
Would you like me to go first? Because I think that kind of builds on the last question. And is that okay, Victoria, if I jump in?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
and then I'll throw maybe the next question can come through. Or I'm sorry, Juan Pablo, does that make sense? Shall I answer that one, or would you prefer? Okay, I actually, because it sort of builds on that last question, and I would say that there's also an importance for us to focus on how we help the people that are going to the COP processes that are not young people to learn how to listen. So I think that's part of this equation, right? So it's I think there needs to be a series of processes just to make sure that the people who are not young have an understanding of how important those youth voices are, and again have the patience and the real sort of commitment to actively listening to the contributions.
Thank you so much, Char. I think that there is so much engagement. I keep like seeing from all over the place, just expressing their appreciation for your talk. Somebody asked if they can marry you. Well, yeah, I guess that's another way to say that they really appreciated what you were saying, and especially your energy. So thank you so much for being here with us today. And I'm just going to leave the floor to Victoria. I think there are many questions for you as well, but I think maybe if you want to summarize some of the insights that you were already maybe sharing with us in the chat, maybe that would be easier.
Yes. You know, we are excited about the possibility of strength in numbers. And this is where I believe mobile gaming is such a wonderful place to congregate, create a movement, really get people together. But also, you know, for us, it's creating the tools to make it easier to have an effect on change. And this is what this wonderful panel has been all about. How do we make our voices be heard? How do we, you know, create these collective movements where we actually affect the real change? And this is, our company is structured and built to take advantage of this. And also we have very bold goals to really expand and help, you know, educate, but also fund what needs funding. There's always a lack of funding in all these important areas. And that's where we come in, because we want to facilitate this and really, really help, you know, turn the ship around.
Amazing. Thank you so much once again. I hope everybody can see the QR code on the slides, and go run and download the game, and then let us know if you managed to play and what you think about it. I think I'm going to give the word back to Char, because I believe she would like to end with the point that she was referencing to before.
I thank you for the opportunity. And I just thought, because I did have it with me, it is a practice I'm trying to do, which is to end with some poetry. So I've got a poem here it's called The Hopi Elders Speak. You have been telling the people that this is the 11th hour, and now you must go back and tell them that this is the hour, and there are things to be considered. Where are you living? What are you doing? What are your relationships? Are you in the right relationships? Where is your water? Know your garden. It is time to speak your truth. Create your own community. Be good to each other and do not look outside yourself for the leader. This could be a good time. There is a river running very fast. It is so great and swift that there are those that will be very afraid. They will hold on to the shore. They will feel they are being torn apart, and they will suffer greatly. Know that the river has a destination. The elders say we must let go of the shore, push off into the middle, keep our eyes open and our heads above the water, see who is in there with you, and celebrate. At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves. For the moment we do, our growth and journey comes to a halt. The time of the lone wolf is over. Gather yourselves, banish the word struggle from your attitude and vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in a sacred time and in celebration. We are the ones we have been waiting for.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Char, for sharing it. I was just saying, I'm sorry for people tuning in other languages. We just thought to like go with the flow and have this spontaneous poem just right now, because I think it was a marvelous way to end the session. So I'm just going to share the final slides to give a few logistical announcements just to close off this wonderful session. Thank you so much for being so engaging throughout. It was really, really great to see everybody participating so much. And we still have very many questions from the Menti that we'll try our best to get to our speakers. Just a little reminder that our next session is going to be on the 9th of August, and it's going to be about climate policy. We're going to hear from George Wamukoya and Thomas Hale. George is the team leader at Agnes and lead negotiator on agriculture, and Thomas Hale is a professor of global public policy at the University of Oxford. The session will provide an overview of the architecture of the Paris Agreement and how the UNFCCC works. We'll discuss trends in the UNFCCC over the past 3 to 5 years and how policymakers can navigate climate dynamics when development needs are also so pressing. We will hear about what negotiators do at COPs and how young people can support them in their role. I really hope that you found this session inspiring and helpful, and just another reminder that please do not worry about the attendance form, as we will share it via email to the participants. So I hope you could relax and enjoy and learn from the amazing speakers that we had today. Also a little reminder about the Terra partnership. Most of our participants will know that we partner up with Terra. So if you haven't already, go and check your inbox to see how you can access this wonderful learning platform that complements all the resources that we offer every 2 weeks. Just before ending, as always, a big thanks to the funders and contributors that made the course possible in the first place, and of course to our wonderful partners, eco-interpreters, that are there patiently helping us to spread the message as widely as possible. We do look forward to welcome you back in 2 weeks. And for all the other people that have joined us for the first time, thank you so much for being with us. We hope that you found everything as insightful as we did. And we look forward to the possibility of you catching up with the material once it's available online and be part of our journey together. For now, I'm just going to say thanks and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Just for closing a bit, I'm able to join at the end. Here is Agustin Ocaña, the chairman and one of the founders of the Global Youth Coalition, and we really hope that you enjoy this session. And we need commitment, guys. We are just in half of the way of this program, and we really need your commitment. We really need you to keep in touch with the program, to join the session, to share what you have learned in social media, and because we're really working hard, as you cannot imagine, to make this possible, to reach these amazing high-level speakers. And thank you so much. I'm really, really happy for the session of today. And we in the Global Youth Coalition, we are working also hard to see how we can get more people to COP28 and reach us in our social media. Ciao.